Good afternoon. Welcome to another episode of Out of Isolation, the web series where we as tour guides go out into the city of Melbourne so you don't have to. Today we are recording from the Yarra River. Look at that right there. I'm Hugo, by the way. Probably should have introduced myself first, but there you go. And I want to tell you a little more about where I am right here because I am standing on the edge of Enterprise Wharf. Enterprise Wharf, so named because the very first ship that docked here unloading the first European settlers back on the 30th of August 1835 was a ship called the Enterprise. It arrived right here, and those 8 people at the time were considered to be part of an illegal settlement. They were trespassing right here. Luckily, the government eventually decided that those people could stay. They had to pay the government, though, for the land that they wanted to settle on. And believe it or not, within 50 years, this tiny colonial outpost, described as nothing more than a sleepy wool port at the very edge of the civilized world, turned into the richest city in the world. Now, that's a story for another day. Before that, though, let's talk a little more about this river. Today, believe it or not, this is one of the healthier rivers running through a capital city. But it wasn't always the case. For a long time, we have treated this river with not the respect it deserves. Abattoirs all along the banks of the river here, spilling in waste. We didn't have a sewerage system in Melbourne until almost 50 years after this city was founded. So you can imagine the human waste and feces that runs down into the river here. We also dig the banks deeper and wider. We straighten out this serpentine-like river. It means all these loose clay particles have now been disturbed in the river. It wouldn't be so much of a problem, except that there was a waterfall just around here. Now that waterfall was blown up. The effect was to have better river transport, which is what it did, but it also created this salt water flowing back upstream. That little waterfall separated the salt and the the salt water and the fresh water. Now this salt water travels all the way up the Yarra River. Those loose clay particles become suspended in this salty water now, and now we have this brown river. The river that runs upside down, as it's sometimes called. Still healthy today. In the last few years, the government, the council have done a great job in cleaning this up. But I wouldn't go swimming in it. There is a bit of a tradition, though, for the winners of the Australian Open to have a dip in the Yarra River. Probably no one's told them that's not a wise idea, but even today you see some of the winners of the Australian Open go for a dip. Now I'm walking over to a place where most of the first people who arrived in Melbourne would have come. Customs House. Now originally this was nothing more than a tent. This was set up only 2 years after this was settled. After a tent, they thought they needed something a bit more permanent. A weatherboard cabin was made, and it was nothing special. It was described as a shabby, leaky, comfortless weatherboard cabin. It was then turned into one of Melbourne's first stone buildings. Well, it was, in fact, Melbourne's first stone building. It wasn't much loved. It probably had the title back in the 1850s of the most unloved and ugliest of all Melbourne's public buildings. There's a few other buildings in the next century or two that could probably claim that title, though. Luckily, we had the gold rush in the 1850s. A huge amount of wealth came into this city, and anybody who was coming into Melbourne, there were quite a few of them, and any goods that were coming into Melbourne were taxed quite highly. 4/5 of the revenue of this early settlement came through Customs House. Let's go check it out. Ooh, Green Man, we're in luck. Now today, Customs House is the Immigration Museum, a place where almost all school children, myself included, will have been to learn about the migrants who shaped Victoria, who shaped Melbourne. I mean, unless you're an Indigenous Australian, your ancestors most likely arrived here by boat. So the story of Australia is a story of migration, and Customs House could be considered to be the Ellis Island, in a way, of Melbourne. Here we go. Now, this is the first time I'm using this special little gimbal thing on my phone. There we go. Reminiscent of Athenian architecture. Those really classic architectural styles. One of the more beautiful buildings of Melbourne. When this was constructed, the Grand Palace inside here was to show off Melbourne's wealth of this tiny new colonial city to the world. A source of pride amongst the government and many of the locals here. I'm going to cross over. I'm going to show you one other thing around here. A set of buildings that are called the Banana Vaults. One of the more interestingly named... Oh, there we go. One of the more interestingly named buildings in Melbourne, and I'll tell you why. See, the Banana Vaults and Banana Alley that it's connected to was where produce would be brought. Now, in the early days of the settlement, horses and cart would be bringing produce in from the paddocks around Melbourne. But as the settlement continued to grow and train lines were built, goods were coming in from further and further away. Goods were originally coming in from as far north as Queensland. Bananas, in fact. Now, bananas had to be picked while they were quite green, so they wouldn't ripen too much on the long journey over. They were brought here, and they were actually stored in these vaults, just behind me here. Here they are. These became known as the Banana Vaults because the people who wanted to sell their goods at the market would hold fresh fruit, like bananas, into the subterranean caverns that were built in here. They would even ripen the bananas in here and then later bring them to the markets. It's quite a storied history to these buildings here because they did fall into disrepair. In the 1960s and 70s in particular, this was known as a place where homeless people would inhabit and was not a safe place to be. A number of murders even occurring into these vaults here. Now today, they've had a little bit of a revitalisation. There's a famous nightclub in here. It is like partying in one of those subterranean Berlin bars or clubs. I've spent a couple of nights in there. There's 24-hour gyms, there's cafes, but certainly this area is still in a state of flux. Perhaps we'll see another revitalisation of this area. But when you hear about these places being called the Banana Vaults, now you know why. This has been another episode of Out of Isolation. I'm Hugo from Walks 101. We are doing these series so you don't have to be out on the streets of Melbourne. We are doing it for you. We are doing what we love as tour guides. So tune in for more episodes and we'll see you soon.